I grew up in eastern Tennessee, in a quiet town tucked against the Blue Ridge line. Folks there lived slow. But me? I was born with my foot on the gas. In my 20s, I drove a '74 Chevy Nova like it was part of my body. I didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't hang out in Barcy, just drove. Speed was my poison. The roar of that engine and the curves of Limestone Cove gave me a high that nothing else could touch. And like every fool who thinks he's untouchable, I told myself I was better than the ones who didn't make it home. One spring evening, the road finally called in its debt. I remember the blur of headlights, the scream of tires, the smell of burning oil, and then silence. A year of hospitals followed. 7 months before I could even stand again. That wreck didn't just break my bones. It broke the arrogance that kept me from seeing the world for what it was. When I finally came home limping, half the man I used to Beta Mountains looked different. They weren't just hills anymore. They were alive, watching, while I healed. The only visitor who made me feel human again was my grandfather, Earl McCrae. He was 83 then, skin like worn leather, eyes bright as spring water. He'd bring a pot of soup, beans, and a wedge of cornbread, set it down, and say, "Boy, eat while it's hot. You can't think on an empty belly." And then he'd tell stories. Stories about the old mines that ran like veins beneath those hills. Stories about the little men who tap on stone, as he called them, tomahawk knockers. Said the Cornish miners brought those tales here when they came to dig our earth in the 1700s. According to him, they weren't demons or angels, just spirits of the mountain, half men and half memory, who warned miners before a cave-in. "If you ever hear that knocking, boy," he said, "you thank him and get the hell out." I laughed it off, but he wasn't smiling. When Grandpa Earl passed that winter, the silence in my life grew unbearable. I moved into the little cabin he'd left behind, a sagging place near the tree line, with creaking floors and a cellar that always smelled of wet rock. At first, I tried to keep busy, fixed fences, cleared brush, but by spring I found myself walking farther and farther into the woods, chasing the ghosts of his stories. One afternoon, I found something that made my heart stop. Rails, rust-eaten, half buried in moss, curling out of the earth like bones. No trees grew there, no grass, just that soft, dead moss covering the ground. When I brushed it aside, the earth sounded hollow. That night, I sat on the porch, staring at Grandpa's old map, hand-drawn, faded with age. And there it was, a mark for a lead mine abandoned in 1892. I told myself I'd find it. For him. For the story. My cousin Tim was supposed to come with me on a 2-day hike. But the day before, his boy fell and broke his leg. He backed out, and I told him I'd go alone. "Hell, it's just up the ridge," I said. "What's the worst that could happen?" He laughed. Famous last words. "Man." At dawn, I set out with a flashlight, rope, and a thermos of coffee. The air was crisp and golden, pine needles crunching under my boots. By noon, I was deep in country most folks don't wander anymore. The forest grew older the higher I climbed, trees thick as silos, roots curling like knuckles over stone. When I crossed a narrow creek, I caught the faint smell of iron, cold and metallic. Something about it made my chest tighten. Finally, the trail widened and curved around a rise. That's when I saw it. A wooden frame half buried in earth, blackened by time, marking the mouth of the mine. The sun didn't reach inside. It was a hole into something ancient and patient. My pulse quickened, half from excitement, half from a fear I couldn't name. "Late last night and the night before," I whispered, quoting Grandpa. "Tomahawk knockers, tomahawk knockers, knocking at my door." The words echoed back, soft and warped. I laughed nervously and told myself it was just the acoustics. The first breath I took inside that mine chilled me straight through. It wasn't just cold, it was wrong. The air tasted stale, metallic, like it had been trapped for a century. I flicked on my flashlight. The beam carved a narrow tunnel of light through the dark. Old timbers held the ceiling like ribs. 30 feet in, the daylight behind me shrank to a silver coin. I told myself I'd just go far enough to see the main chamber. The tunnel curved left, then dropped slightly. My boots slid on loose gravel. A few yards later, I reached a wide opening in underground room bigger than a church hall. Abandoned mining carts lay on their sides. Rust-eaten pickaxes and helmets sat where men had left them generations ago. And carved into one wall was a strange series of marks, small, shallow gouges in sets of 3. That's when I heard it. Tap, 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 like metal striking rock from somewhere deeper inside. I froze. It came again. Tap, 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 tap. I lifted the light, scanning the walls. Nothing. Then came the whispering. It wasn't wind. It wasn't echo. It was language, low, rhythmic, layered, like a prayer in a tongue I couldn't understand. My heart thudded against my ribs. Hello? I called. The whispering stopped. For one long second, the mind held its breath. Then the tapping began again, closer this time. A flicker at the edge of my light made me turn. Something moved between 2 collapsed beams, small, hunched, gray. My mouth went dry. I took one hesitant step back, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The thing stepped forward. It was no taller than my waist. Its skin caked in soot and clay. A rusted pick hung from one hand. But its eyes, God help might's eyes, glowed like embers from a dying fire. It opened its mouth, and a voice came out that sounded like metal dragging across stone. Leave, it said, before it's too late. My knees locked. My breath caught in my throat. Then movement behind it. Dozens of faint glows flickering in the dark. More eyes. More shapes. Jesus, I whispered. The ground began to tremble. Pebbles rained from the ceiling. The little figure raised its pick and shouted something that wasn't English. And suddenly every voice joined in a roaring, echoing chorus that shook the air. I turned and ran. The tunnel behind me groaned as timbers splintered. Rocks cascaded down. Dust filled my lungs. When I burst into daylight, a shockwave of air followed me out. I stumbled onto the moss, gasping, just as the entrance collapsed with a deafening crash. Silence returned to the mountain. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes, saw that first one looking at me with a mix of anger and grief. They hadn't meant to kill me. They'd saved me from being buried alive. But they hated me for waking them. For days, I tried to shake it off. I told myself I'd imagined oxygen deprivation. Nerves. Whatever. But the knocking wouldn't stop. It followed me home. Sometimes it came from the walls. Sometimes from under the floorboards. Soft. Measured. Metallic. Tap. Tap. Tap, tap. I started sleeping in my truck. One night, around midnight, I nodded off in the recliner. The old house creaked in the wind. The TV hummed static. Then I heard it again. Faint, but unmistakable. From below. Tap. 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 The cellar. I told myself it was pipes. Or the furnace. Or rats. Anything but what I knew it was. But the sound grew louder. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the cellar door. The chain on the latch rattled. Then came a single, thunderous blow-bang. That splintered the wood. Another strike. Then another. A pickaxe head burst through the panel. Inches from my knee. 3 sets of eyes glowed in the gap. I screamed, slammed the door shut, wrapped the chain, and ran out into the night barefoot. The woods swallowed me whole. I didn't stop until I reached the lights of Shorty's General Store. Miles down the highway, I collapsed beside the ice machine, shaking until dawn. Shorty found me there at sunrise. He thought I'd been attacked or maybe drunk. When I told him what I'd seen, his face went pale. "Don't talk about that," he muttered. "Just don't." He called my father to come get me. The next day, the news reported a minor earthquake across the state line. Nothing serious, they said, just a small tremor. But when my father drove us up the ridge, my stomach turned to ice. Grandpa's cabin had collapsed. The entire foundation had caved in. The earth had swallowed it whole. My father thought it was the quake. I knew better. The atomic knockers had buried their secret again. I spent months trying to move on. Therapy, medication, church, you name it. Eventually, I found a cheap apartment in an old Victorian house downtown. The owner had split it into 6 units. It was creaky, drafty, but the top floor was mine. I told myself the city noise would drown out the past. For a while, it did. Then, one cold February night, I woke to a familiar sound. Tap, 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 tap. It came from the radiator. I told myself it was just old pipes expanding. But deep down, I knew that rhythm. They hadn't forgotten. And when I leaned close to the vent, I swear I heard a voice whisper, faint and metallic. Some nights I think about that wreck all those years ago, about how I used to speed through the mountains like they belonged to me. Maybe this was always coming. Maybe I didn't just crash my carry woke something up that day. The same way I woke them up in that mine. There's a kind of justice in it. I suppose. The mountains take back what's theirs. It's nearly midnight as I write this. Outside, snow drifts against the window. The pipes hiss. And somewhere inside these walls, I hear the faint, deliberate rhythm again. Tap, 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 tap. I should leave. But where would I go? The hollow's inside me now. If you ever find yourself hiking in the Appalachians and come across a patch of moss where nothing grows, don't touch it. Don't dig. And for the love of God, if you hear knocking, don't knock back. This story isn't just about superstition, it's about what happens when arrogance meets consequence. The mountains don't care who you are. Neither does life. Now, I'd like to hear from you. Do you think the violence that comes from ignorance and pride is ever justified? Have you ever witnessed someone punished for their own recklessness or punished unfairly? Share your thoughts below. Let's talk about the fine line between justice and cruelty, between warning and revenge.